So I'm Richard Carrico, and my background is both as an archaeologist and a historian and an author. And my genre, if you will, goes all the way from true crime here in San Diego County, that we can talk about in a minute, to this particular book here. And it's called The El Presidio de San Diego, uh, basically excavating Southern California's lost city. Most people, be they tourists, be they local people, or people who've moved here in the last 5, 10, 15 years, whatever, don't realize that the first Spanish settlement in all of Alta California, not counting Baja California, but Alta California, was here in San Diego, and it was not in Mission Valley. There is a mission in Mission Valley, and if you go there, there's a big sign out front that says California's first mission. Well, that's a lie. It was not there. It was on Presidio Hill. Is on Presidio Hill. And it got covered up over the years and ultimately became what's now Presidio Park. And so there was no one book, and I give a lot of tours there. There was no one book that a tourist or a local could pick up and find out who lived at the Presidio. How did they get by? What did they eat? Were Native Americans there? Were they enslaved? What was going on up there? So that's what the El Presidio de San Diego book is about. And there is archaeology about the floors and the adobe tiles and all that, but it's more about the people, because I think, for me at least, that's what history is all about. So 2 years ago or so, this book came out, and I was doing research on something very different. This is sort of how life works sometimes, right? Serendipity. I was researching things for local Native American tribe, and I kept seeing in 1931 newspapers unsolved murders of young women. And one was hanged, one was stabbed, one was thrown off of a pier, apparently. All these different stories. Yeah. And there were 8 of them in 1931 of just women in San Diego. And so I kept collecting things, as historians tend to do. And then at some point, I decided to write a book on it. So I nailed it down to 3 young women, a 10-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 24-year-old. And at first thought maybe there was a serial killer, because everybody likes serial killers, right? Uh, I don't think it was. I think there were 3 individual killers, and ultimately pulled these stories together. And again, my focus was about these young women. Who were they and how were they treated? For instance, the 17-year-old was indeed beautiful, and she'd even done some modeling. But the newspapers, when her death was reported, described her as voluptuous, statuesque, buxom, very attractive. And yet if a man was killed that same day, a young man, it didn't say studly, muscular, well hung, right? It simply said young attorney killed. And that was part of the yellow journalism of the time period. So what I wanted to do was kind of bring these 3 young women back to life. I ended up finding some of their relatives and interviewing them. I got all the crime reports. I got the autopsies. I became kind of possessed by this. And for those, if you happen to know where Mission Trails Regional Park is, one of the young women was found naked and hanging from a tree in what's now Mission Trails Regional Park. And I'm here to tell you, except in Coronado, women do not take their clothes off and commit suicide by hanging. That just does not happen. Well, you pitch a publisher. So I wrote a query letter to a publisher that I knew did true crime called Wild Blue Press, and made them a pitch. And they got back to me much faster than I thought they would, and said, "Can you have this done in the next 9 months?" Called my bluff, as it were. And I said, "Sure, sure, I can do that." And I did. And I did. So it's both of these books are on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and both of them are in bookstores around town. And I'm giving a whole series of talks on the El Presidio book in the near future. So if you or any of your friends are history buffs and you want to come to a book signing, although if you buy the book today, it's a little cheaper than it will be at the book signing. But if you know somebody who might be interested in that, with a PowerPoint and walking you through the Presidio of 1772. I had pretty well put the stories together, and at one point, the San Diego Union or Tribune, whatever they're called now, they were interested in maybe doing little pieces every other week or something. So I had it largely together. Were she still alive, my mother would tell you that from the time I could practically write, and I apparently wrote pretty early, I would write little short stories, 1 page, 2 page, about a dog, about going to the zoo. So I think that, and I don't believe in instinct necessarily, but that ability to think and write and want to tell people, tell stories, in telling stories, both in the good way of telling stories and in fibbing to people, I've always been very, very good at, according to my grandmother and other people over the years, right? So I think that was that was always sort of there. And then in high school, I went to San Diego High School downtown. Um, any English class I really did well at, the writing part of it, and became somewhat skilled at it. So I think that was always there. But when I got into teaching, and at San Diego State, they have their own Department of American Indian Studies. So it's not anthropology, it's not history. And I realized that there was no one book, this is in 2008, there was no one book on the local Native American Kumeyaay people. So I wrote it. And I took my lectures and my public presentations and kind of realized what worked and what didn't work, what made people interested. They really didn't want a whole bunch of dates and stuff. They wanted to know about the people and, how'd they eat? Did they, how'd they marry? How'd they divorce? Blah, blah, blah. So I wrote this book in 2000, and now it's in its fourth edition. It's called Strangers in a Stolen Land, and it has done really well. To write an academic, like that book is a little academic, the one about Native Americans, but again, it was for students. But I've written over 30 academic articles in refereed peer-reviewed journals, which frankly means they're boring as hell, because they're very academic. You can't use the word model. You have to say paradigm, right? Yeah. You don't say use, you got to say utilized. So as I would write all those, so I've been writing for 20, 30 years in terms of that. When I switched to writing true crime and even the one on the Presidio, and I had to switch my vocabulary and the way you phrase things. And typically, you want shorter paragraphs, shorter sentences, and lots of grabs. You want the reader to be grabbed constantly. Whereas in the academic journals, you're not actually trying to grab anybody, you're just reporting facts. So that took a little brain adjustment. And there's this program called Pro Writing Aid. It's not AI, but you run your text through there and it comes back and says, you're writing this for a graduate school audience. Well, I wasn't trying to write a true crime for graduate school, so I had to go in and change it. I retired from teaching at San Diego State. I taught there 30 years ago, 30 years in the Department of Indian Studies. And so what I do now is I write and cut brush. That's what I was doing before I came here to the book signing today. Generally, I write in the mornings, and I get up depending on my dog, my dog, my border collie, between 6:15, 6:30. Make a pot of French roast coffee, and then try to get seriously writing by about 7 o'clock. And I try to write for the next 5 hours, from 7 till noon, something like that. But as my wife would tell you, uh, I'm kind of scatterbrained about some things, meaning, for instance, right now I'm working on another true crime book about a guy called the Pinup Killer who buried these young women out in the Anza Borrego Desert. Well, I work on that. I know. I work on that for a couple of hours and then maybe take another coffee break. And then I decide instead I want to work on a book I'm working on, this country western guy in the 1950s who tortured and killed his wife, a guy named Spade Cooley. So I work on that for a couple of hours. And then I'm doing a couple academic articles, but generally 5 hours, but it's not always sometimes it is the whatever specific topic because I'm focused on it, but otherwise I compartmentalize really well. So I keep, this is old school. I keep, either index cards or stick 'em notes of this would be a good story, or, I'm in a couple writing groups, so sometimes I'll pass something on to somebody and say, well, you're more of a romance writer. but you do historical fiction. Here's a story. Wyatt Earp lived in San Diego. He lived downtown. His building's still down there. Maybe you want to go and do something about Wyatt Earp and Josie. Well, there's a mantra in all these writing groups that you go to and conferences, and it's overdone, but it's true. And it's show, don't tell. If somebody would have told me that, because again, academically, it's about telling. Here's my table, here's how many burials, blah, blah, blah. But readers don't want to be told, they want to be shown. So, have the guy unwrap his cellophane wrapper on his Chesterfield cigarette, and kind of get in the weeds with details, because that's what people really want. If you simply say unwrapped his pack of cigarettes, that's not very evocative, right? So if somebody would have told me that 10 years ago when I started leaning more towards this style of writing, popular, let's call it popular writing, that would have been very helpful. Because then when I went to critiques with some of my early stuff, people went, what you've written before, what do you write? And I said, books and articles on Indians. Yeah, yeah, it shows. Stop doing that. Stop telling people, right? Clearly, you're a smart guy and you know this stuff, but stop telling it. Something people can feel, and I think that's part of it too, is to make your reader feel, be it whatever, dread or happiness or love or cold, wet collars, whatever it is, make them feel it, because then they want to go on, and they don't want the wet collar for very long. They want the guy to get out of the rain, right? And if you simply try to tell them he went out of the rain, it's not the same. I actually am a pretty patient person doing archaeology and stuff, but that the process of writing and rewriting, and now I know it takes 6, 7, 8 drafts of something. Plus, you probably should have at least one or two beta readers that are not your friends. And the calendar is moving along, and the stand's going through the hourglass, and I want to get this thing done. And I'm, in one case, well, the Presidio book, two of the chapters completely rewrote, because somebody who is more of a popular writer locally here, well, she's on a boat. Jennifer Redman is a really great editor. She said, "This is crazy. Your first 5 chapters are amazing. You bring people in, you talk about, and the endings are great. And it's called in writing muddling through the middle. That a lot of times the middle books are not very good at first, if ever. Right. So that would have all been good if somebody would have said, this is a big process, and just because you think you're done, you're not. You're just beginning."